Welcome to my new podcast, what I would like to call How I Got Goosebumps. And this is going to be the first episode, really. It's more or less sort of like a introduction into the series that I'm going to be covering. And also along the way, I will probably throw in some true spooky stuff that has happened to me over the years. But what this podcast is going to primarily be is more or less about the Goosebumps series of books and TV shows as well. And so within this series, what I'm going to be doing is covering each Goosebumps book, as well as trying to compare them to the TV episode equivalent. Now, unfortunately, what I have learned over the years of researching the Goosebumps series is that not every single Goosebumps book was adapted into a episode on TV. And growing up, I wasn't really allowed to watch the Goosebumps show, primarily because I was very afraid as a kid of most things. But hopefully what this podcast can be used for is to inform you about the Goosebumps sort of series as a whole and try to understand the books themselves. Now, what this episode is going to be over is a intro into Rl Stein himself, as well as trying to kind of explain why he decided to write the books, what other sort of series of books he has written, and things like that. So I'm going to start off by talking about Rl Stein. Rl Stein actually isn't his real name, and it's been known that family members actually don't even call him by Rl Stein as well. His real name is Robert Lawrence Stine. He was born on October 8th, 1943, in Columbus, Ohio. So in the United States. His parents' names were Anne and Louis Stein, and he also had two siblings, a brother and a sister, Harlan and Pamela. Whenever R.L. Stein was very young, at the age of 9, he discovered a typewriter in his parents' attic. And discovering this typewriter really gave him the push that he really needed to begin making his series of books and writing short stories and that sort of thing. And the funniest thing about finding this typewriter is he actually started writing sort of these joke books where they were just sort of funny sort of things. And he would just lock himself into his room and just type away. And I think that's really great. Whenever he found something he was very passionate about, he just took off with it. He went to the moon with it. He didn't feel bad whenever probably other people thought, it's just a phase sort of thing. But ever since he was 9 and he found that typewriter, he never stopped. And I think that's fantastic. So while he was in school, he was more of a introverted sort of type of person. He wasn't very good at some subjects like math, and he hated gym class. But apparently he was actually a very good ping pong player, which is funny, I suppose. So now we're going to skip ahead to 1965, whenever he finally graduated from Ohio State University, where he decided to head straight for New York City to become a full-fledged writer. He has written dozens of joke books and funny books and humor books and stuff like that for kids. He also wrote the Bananas magazines, and he did those magazines for 10 years. And in those days, he wrote under a pseudonym name of Jovial Bob Stein, which was one of his other names. He would later go on to be called R.L. Stein whenever he would write the Fear Street novels. Later in 1969, he married Jane Waldhorn, and Jane became an editor and a writer, and they worked together on several kids' books. Then soon after, Jane and Rl Stein partnered together, and they formed their own publishing company, Parachute Press. And Parachute Press created all of Stein's most popular books. A fun little tidbit is that Stine still lives in New York with his wife, and he has 2 dogs, Minnie and Nadine. He also has a son, Matthew, who is a composer and a sound designer. And Matt Stine married his wife in 2014 and had a son. So Rl Stein is actually a grandfather at the moment. Now we're going to head into Rl Stein's history with Goosebumps and sort of the upbringing of Goosebumps as a whole. So in the early 90s, Rl Stein was already writing the Fear Books series of books, and he tried to aim them towards teenagers and younger audiences, so adults wouldn't get much out of it. He had an editor at the time, and they suggested that he tried to write a horror book series for an even younger audience of preteens, because at the time, horror books for preteens really didn't exist. And so Stine was somewhat reluctant to write a horror book series for that sort of audience because it hasn't been tapped into very well or at all. And so Stine was kind of scared himself to write all these books or even take the time to do that. And then it just wouldn't kick off. And he really didn't want to put Fear Street in this sort of corner and stop writing those to write something that's completely on the other end of the spectrum. And so for his audience of Fear Street readers, they would pick up this new Goosebumps series and not want to read it because it was for kids, really, compared to teenagers. But he decided to write his first Goosebumps book anyway. So Stine was pretty much just sitting in his house trying to think of a name for his new series. He couldn't think of anything. So he was reading one of the TV Guide magazines, and he saw an ad on the bottom of one of the pages, and it just said, "It's Goosebumps Week on Channel 11." And so Rl Stein thought that was the perfect name for his series, Goosebumps. And later on, he was under contract to write a 4-book series under the name of Goosebumps after he decided to keep that name. And the very first 4 Goosebumps books were Welcome to Dead House, Stay Out of the Basement, Monster Blood, and Say Cheese and Die. The first 3 books were released around the same time in July of 1992. Sales for the series were initially very low. It didn't kick off like he thought, and Fear Street was probably suffering because of it as well. However, within the next few months, the sales of the books just skyrocketed. They went out of proportions and did very, very well. So because of the success of this new Goosebumps series, Scholastic reached out to Stine and wanted to extend his book contract to 6 more books. So on top of the first 4, they wanted 6 more. And so after Rl Stein wrote the next 6 books, sales just kept going up and up and up. Eventually, it came down to where Stine was given a contract to write a book a month. So during an interview with Rl Stein, he commented that it would only take about 8 days to write a single Goosebumps book. Before he would start writing, he would spend a few days outlining. And he said that the books about summer camp were the hardest to write since he had never been to a summer camp before. And so over time, he would talk about his books in the Goosebumps series, and he would somewhat try and think of ways as to how he came about writing them. So Welcome to Dead House was, of course, the very, very first book to be ever released in the Goosebumps name. And Stine says that he believes that it's his scariest. And as somebody who has read that book, I completely agree with that. It's the darkest, in my opinion. It has the most scares, in my opinion. It's very, very good book. Compared to a lot of the other Goosebumps books, I find Welcome to Dead House to be the best. Rl Stein even says that he believes that Welcome to Dead House is even too scary for kids to be reading. As it was his first book, he really didn't have a formula yet, so he was sort of just thinking of something and tried to write it down the best he could, but probably tried to make it out to where it would be easy for kids to read and not be too scared to keep going. And of course, later on down the line, he has this formula where it's a mixture of comedy and horror. So he even said that if he wanted to rewrite it, he would probably put more funny stuff in it to make it less scary. Next, he decided to talk about Stay Out of the Basement, which was the second book. And he came to this idea for Stay Out of the Basement when an image flashed into his head of a father taking off his baseball cap and leaves were growing out of his head instead of hair. And then he started to ask himself questions like, how did he have leaves on his head? And who is the father? And why is he turning into a plant? Or was he already a plant? Stine also mentioned that this being one of his favorite Goosebumps books he had ever written. Now, Stay Out of the Basement for me was not the most interesting. I found it to be rather wanting, but that, of course, reading them as an adult, things are very different from a adult's perspective comparing to a 12-year-old's. And so probably back in the day, if I was to read Stay Out of the Basement, it probably would have been a lot scarier. But at the moment, Stay Out of the Basement is not one of my favorites. I do have a few favorites, though. Some that I actually go back and reread because they were actually really good. Next in the Goosebumps series was Monster Blood, Book 3. And according to Stine, he was inspired to write this book after his son, Matt, got his green slime toy stuck to the wall and he couldn't get it off. In his initial final 4-book contract was Say Cheese and Die. And so Stine thought of the title for this book whenever he was walking his dog, and he said that it's one of the titles he's most proud of. Stine initially suggested that the title of this book was a joke, figuring the publishers would choose another name. And at the time, of course, we all know the cover art for the Goosebumps books being very, very interesting and also sometimes not really matching some of the stuff that happens within the book. And so while the illustrator at the time, Tim Jacobus, was finishing the cover art for Say Cheese and Die, the cover art really didn't match the book whatsoever. So Rl Stein actually added a dream sequence into the book so it could match. The next book was Let's Get Invisible, and Stine has been found to say that he's very fond of that book and that parts of it were actually inspired by the 90s film Flatliners. And then after that, the next book was one of the most popular, Night of the Living Dummy, which a lot of people know as where Slappy first presented himself to the world. So how he got the idea for Slappy the Dummy was, as a child, Stine's mom would read him a chapter out of Pinocchio every night. There were 2 scenes in the book that actually scared him as a kid. The first scene was when Pinocchio had enough of the cricket lectures, and he smashed the cricket against the wall with a wooden mallet. The second was when Pinocchio fell asleep with his feet burning on the wooden stove and burnt both of his feet off. And so he says that these two parts is primarily what inspired him to write Night of the Living Dummy and the other books as well in the Living Dummy sort of trilogy series. The next book in the Goosebumps series was The Girl Who Cried Monster. And Stine once said that in his original manuscript, the librarian in the book actually eats a student, a kid, and everyone thought that maybe that was going a little too far. And so he made the story a little more laid back by letting the monster eat bugs instead. The next book in the series, which is one of my personal favorites, is Welcome to Camp Nightmare. And Stine says that the camp story was based on his son's camp because Rl Stein never went to summer camp as a kid. So through experiences through his son, he was able to come up with a story for this book. The camp his son was sent to, he claims, is like a bug-infested swamp. And so after the success of Camp Nightmare, Stine actually decided to write a camp-themed book every summer due to the success. The next book is called The Ghost Next Door. Stine has described this book as being one of his saddest. As if you don't know what The Ghost Next Door is, it's another really, really good one where it's believed that there's a haunted house next door where a kid is just trying to figure out, why he's a ghost or whatever, but the twist is one I'm going to get into in the episode where I talk about this book, but it's a really, really good book. If you want to go read it, I suggest it. The next book in the original Goosebumps series is the most popular and celebrated, which is The Haunted Mask. Now, The Haunted Mask, in my opinion, is somewhat overrated. It wasn't my favorite. Of course, it was terrifying to me as a kid because it was one of the few Goosebumps TV series episodes I got to watch. And of course, it was being one of the scariest because we checked the Goosebumps series. The only way we were able to watch it as a kid was whenever we would check the VHS tapes out at the local library. And so they had a few Goosebumps episodes on VHS, and we would never get them back because we were just too scared. But The Haunted Mask, Stine says that he was inspired to write this story after his son Matt had trouble taking off a green rubber Frankenstein mask he wore for Halloween. Stine has also said that it is his favorite book in the franchise and that he would love to see a film adaptation of it. And of course, we now have the two big budget Goosebumps movies, which the first one was actually not that bad. I have yet to see the second, however. The next book is called Piano Lessons Can Be Murder. I found this book to be rather weak compared to the others, but the book was originally titled Guitar Lessons Can Be Murder. His son, Matt, again, was taking guitar lessons at the time, so he decided to write a book about this haunted guitar. But people around Rl Stein told him that guitars weren't really that scary, so he changed it to pianos. And I think that was a good change. I don't think guitars are scary. Pianos are far more eerie if done correctly. The next book is The Werewolf of Fever Swamp. And Stine decided to write this book after he was on vacation and he saw a deer on a boat ride. I don't really know how it correlates. The next book was One Day at Horrorland, which is one of my personal favorites because I just love theme park horror. I think it's fantastic. Anytime there's anything that's scary and theme park related, I love it. But according to Stine, he drew maps of Horrorland so that he could picture where each attraction would be while he was writing the book. He also said that it's one of his favorites. Why I'm Afraid of Bees is the next book. He said that this book was written because he knew a lot of people were afraid of bees. Imagine that. The next book is Deep Trouble. And Stine was actually given the suggestion of writing a book with sharks by his nephew, named Dan. Stine also said that if he could be any Goosebumps character, he may want to be Billy Deep because of his exciting life. The next book, Scarecrow Walks at Midnight, says it is one of the scariest Goosebumps books I have yet to read. Scarecrow Walks at Midnight, I'm still working my way through. And he thinks it's the scariest because it takes place in a cornfield. And he thinks cornfields are spooky. The next book is Go Eat Worms, which I believe is the worst Goosebumps book. I did not care for that book. It was very boring. It lacked a lot of things that the other books just had so much of. And even Rl Stein himself said that it's one of his least favorites. And he once said that he wasn't even happy with the story. And there's a little flub on the back cover of the book where it says that the main character, Todd, finds worms in his spaghetti, and that actually never happens in the book whatsoever. Stine actually removed the chapter that included that because it was an error. The next book, Attack of the Mutant, one of my personal favorites. And also Stine says that it is also one of his favorites. And in the past, he has hinted that he would be open to writing a sequel, which I would not mind. The Attack of the Mutant Goosebumps video game is also a really, really cool game. And that game also scared the crap out of me as a kid. The next book is A Night in Terror Tower, which is another one of my favorites. And it was inspired by whenever Stine took a trip to the Tower of London. And in the first draft of the book, it had a lot more scenes where the main characters were just running away. And all of Stine's editors thought that characters just running away all the time was boring. He made the characters in A Night in Terror Tower kind of slow down and catch their breath every here and there. And Rl Stein actually thought that this was one of his scariest Goosebumps books at the time because the main characters didn't even know their names. The Cuckoo Clock of Doom was written because whenever Rl Stein was signing books in a mall bookstore, a girl named Tara walked up to Stine and asked him to make her a character in a Goosebumps book. She said that she wanted her character in the book to be bad or evil. And so Stine decided to write this fan into a Goosebumps book, called her Tara Webster, within the Cuckoo Clock of Doom. The next book, it came from Beneath the Sink, was just another one of the stories that sort of came to his head, where he thought probably about a sponge that could possibly kill people. And that's pretty much it. He saw a sponge, he wrote a book about it. The Barking Ghost, Stine thinks it's one of his least favorites. I've yet to read it, so I have no idea what it's about. The Horror at Camp Jelly Jam. I have read this book, and it's very different compared to a lot of his other books. One of his other working titles for The Horror at Camp Jelly Jam was Smelly Summer. And that makes a lot more sense whenever you read the book. The monster, being King Jelly Jam, comes from this book specifically. And Stine has also said that this is his second favorite Goosebumps cover art. And when asked about a sequel being made to Camp Jelly Jam, he simply jokes about it and pretty much just says no. The Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes, Stine didn't care for because he thought the writing could be better. A Shocker on Shock Street, my personal favorite book. It's not the best, but it's my personal favorite. Stine was actually inspired to write this book after seeing an animatronic at Disney World, which I find very interesting. The Haunted Mask 2, just like the Haunted Mask, Stine said that he would enjoy seeing this book be brought to film. The Egg Monsters from Mars, Stine says that this was his favorite book to write. I've yet to read it. Ghost Camp, Stine thinks this is one of his scariest books he's ever written. Legend of the Lost Legend, Stine just says that he thinks it's one of his favorite titles. Calling All Creeps. According to Stine, he got the book idea from a joke he once played when he was in college, but it ended up backfiring. And another inspiration for this book came from whenever he found telephones scary. The Curse of Camp Cold Lake. Stine once described this book as being one of his scariest works. The Haunted School. I personally enjoyed this one because it's about cloning, and I find that sort of fear interesting. And he got the idea for this when a group of children approached him in a bookstore asking if he could write a book about their school, which they said was haunted. Give Yourself Goosebumps. The Give Yourself Goosebumps series was a series after the original, where you could pretty much just pick and choose your path, and if you chose the wrong path, the protagonist, which is you, actually dies over and over and over again. I've read a few of them. Most aren't that great, but some of them are actually not that bad. Stine said he really enjoyed working on them, but none of the publishers were really interested in reviving the Goosebumps series because after The Haunted School, there was really a dry spell. Then after the Give Yourself Goosebumps series came the TV series, where Rl Stein actually appears at the beginning of a few episodes. And these episodes include The Haunted Mask, A Night in Terror Tower, and Attack of the Mutant. And then shortly after, he started to write books again, of course. The next being Cry of the Cat, which I've only seen the Goosebumps TV series episodes of because there's 2. And I thought the idea for it wasn't too bad. But according to Rl Stein himself, he says that this Goosebumps book was the longest one it took to write. It took a long time to write this one. And he claims he wrote 3 different versions of the book before he and his publishers were satisfied with it. Creature Teacher. Rl Stein describes this as being his favorite Goosebumps cover and one of his favorite Goosebumps books. Invasion of the Body Squeezers Part 1 and 2. Stein says that it is one of his favorite duology Goosebumps series he's ever written. Are You Terrified Yet? Back in 1997, Rl Stein actually teased the title of this book, stating it was going to be a camp-themed book, of course, which actually ended up not being the case. Brain Juice, which is the next book. Rl Stein teased the title of this book whenever he was actually working on the original Goosebumps series, but he actually had trouble coming up with a plot. The book wasn't even finished until March 1998. Ultimately, Stein would go on with the name Brain Juice as one of his favorite Goosebumps books because of the underlying comedy of the situations the protagonists find themselves in. The Mummy Walks. When Rl Stein was in Los Angeles at the airport, he saw parents give their son an envelope who was boarding a flight by himself for the first time. And so he thought it was a great scenario for a kid to be open to the envelope only to find a note that says, "We are not your parents." A scene just like this one takes place in the book, The Mummy Walks. Goosebumps Gold, which is a canceled Goosebumps series. He never even wrote the books. He actually used one of the titles from the Goosebumps Horrorland series of books, Slappy New Year, as one of the books for Goosebumps Gold. And Stein has also said on multiple occasions that The Haunted Mask Lives was published as The Scream of the Haunted Mask, despite claiming that he had never even written the book. The Streets of Panic Park. Stein admitted that he didn't even consider this book being one of his scariest. Little Shop of Hamsters. Stein thought of the title of this book while he was walking his dog, and it was one of the titles he's most proud of. He also says that this book was difficult to write due to him finding it hard to make hamsters scary. Planet of the Lawn Gnomes. Stine was working on the book as early as 2011, a full year before the book's release. And Stine also mentioned that the book is being one of his favorite recent Goosebumps covers. Son of Slappy and Frankenstein's Dog. Stine mentioned these books as being one of his favorite recent Goosebumps books. His thoughts on the Goosebumps films. Stine actually makes cameo appearances near the end of both films, and he was actually very supportive of them as well. And he made a suggestion for any Goosebumps film adaptations, saying, I would like to make it a little scarier and less funny. Which is the complete opposite of whenever he was first writing the books, where he said he would add more jokes and less scares. But with the films, he wanted more scares and less jokes. Attack of the Jack. He originally announced the title as Jack Attack in 2016, and he says that it's one of the recent Goosebumps books he really likes due to it featuring a talking cat, which he claimed is a surprise he got away with. And at one point, he mistakenly said the book is about jack-o'-lanterns coming to life, and it's likely he got it confused with Attack of the Jack-o'-lanterns, a book with a very similar title. And finally, It's Alive, It's Alive. Stine got the idea for this book after learning how popular robotics were in school. Rl Stein was interviewed quite a bit about a lot of his books, but unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of talk about all of them. But I'm glad that he likes to talk about his books. He's fully supportive of the films, and he's actually appeared in them as well. And that's one thing I really like about Rl Stein as a writer. He gets involved, and there are a lot of writers who just sort of like to sit in the background while their works do the work. But Rl Stein tries to get involved, and that's very important to me as a consumer to want to buy more of his product because he actually enjoys what he does. So we are going to skip around a little bit here. And so we're no longer going to be talking about Rl Stein himself. We are going to be talking about the book series and also the TV series as well. So we're going to start with the TV series, which, of course, I get most of my enjoyment out of because I can just kick back and relax and watch my favorite books come to life. However, after watching a lot of the original TV series, it's not great by today's standards. Of course, though, it came out a long time ago. And so the TV series was based off of course, Goosebumps books. And the series ran from 1995 to 1998. So it only ran for 3 years. And it originally aired on Fox Kids. And it's actually currently available on Netflix to watch if you want to go and watch it for yourself. And the entire series is also on iTunes if you want to go and buy it. So the TV show had 4 seasons. It had 74 total episodes. But if you count out all of the 2-part episodes, it comes down to 58. And it first aired on October 28th, 1995. So almost on Halloween, which is fitting. Then there was a rebranded sort of TV series of Goosebumps called Ultimate Goosebumps. And after the first 2 seasons of the original TV series, they changed the name to Ultimate Goosebumps for the 3rd season. And they kept the name Ultimate Goosebumps for the duration of season 3. But the name was changed back to Goosebumps for the 4th season. The intro for the first 2 seasons were the same, but for Ultimate Goosebumps, the 3rd season, they actually changed the intro up a little bit, adding more sound effects and more visually pleasing to the eye crap. From 1996 to 1998, episodes of the Goosebumps show were actually released on VHS by 20th Century Fox, except for Bride of the Living Dummy. And all VHS releases contained 1 2-part episodes from seasons 1 to 3. And in the beginning of 2004, 20th Century Fox began releasing episodes of the TV series to DVD. And the artwork used for the DVD boxes actually used Tim Jacobus art from the actual books. Then in 2008, 4 years later, the Goosebumps DVDs were rebooted, and the artwork was completely remade from the ground up, taking a more realistic sort of style rather than using Jacobus's original art. And then many DVDs were also re-released in 2012 to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Goosebumps as a whole. Now it's time to actually talk about the original Goosebumps books series, which contained a total of 62 books and first started in July of 1992 and ended in December of 1997. So for 5 years, the original book series was running. And then after that, it was followed by Series 2000 books. Then in 2003 to 2007, 57 books out of the 62 were actually reprinted with new covers and used different colors for the covers as well. And some of the books actually even had new taglines than the originals. Then these reprints were actually discontinued after the classic Goosebumps sort of collection was introduced, where it's more reprints, but under a different title. So this classic Goosebumps set was originally made to go with the new Goosebumps Horrorland series of books. And these new classic Goosebumps books had new cover art made by Brandon Dorman. And there was also a brand new Goosebumps logo as well. Then the font for the chapter titles was changed, and little bonus features were added at the end of each book as well. There are actually a few collections you can buy. One of them being Monster Blood Pack, where it included Monster Blood 2, and Monster Blood 3, all 3 books, and a small container of slime. And it was only released in September of 1995. Then there was the Goosebumps Monster Edition. And between 1995 and 1997, Scholastic released 4 hardcover books under the series titled Goosebumps Monster Edition. And each edition contained 3 Goosebumps books instead of just 1. And each book actually included special features such as a grating sound when opening the book. And then Monster Edition 1s and 3 were reprinted in 2003. And the covers shown on the back of the books were updated to match the reprints. There was the Goosebumps Collection, which were 4 hardcover books under the series titled Goosebumps Collection. And they were released between 2003 and 2005. Each book contained 3 books from the franchise, which were the Campfire Collection, Monster Blood Collection, and the Living Dummy Collection. And it contained all 3 stories from the original series. While the 3rd book, 30 Tales to Give You Goosebumps, featured the first 3 books in the Tales to Give You Goosebumps series. There was Goosebumps Bind Up, which is similar to the Goosebumps Collection, in a way that they are a collection of books that contain 3 books each. However, each book were only available in paperback. Then there was the Goosebumps Retro Collector's Tins, which I have been actually trying my best to find, which is very hard. But the tins included 5 of the all-time best-selling books in the series. The lids of the tins featured a raised Goosebumps logo. So whenever you would touch it with your finger, it felt like it was there. And the cover art from all 3 books included behind it. The sides of the base of the tin featured the covers of the books repeated throughout it, and under the base of the tin featured a G logo splat. And for the collector's tin, while the books do support the original art and design, there are some difference between the original prints, which is the Goosebumps logo on the front cover is not raised. The logo on the chapter designs in the books use the classic Goosebumps design rather than the originals. The books are now thinner and more floppy. The Scholastic logo is featured under the book title instead of being on the bottom left. And the cover for Why I'm Afraid of Bees uses white text for the tagline, while the original used black. Then, oddly enough, there were graphic novels, sort of like comic books, released. And I have read one of them, and the artwork is fantastic. And so a few books were adapted into these graphic novels, known as Goosebumps Graphics with an X. And the 4 Goosebumps Graphics books were titled Creepy Creatures, Terror Trips, Scary Summer, and Slappy's Tales of Horror. So after the success of the original Goosebumps series, there were quite a few spin-offs made. The first spin-off series debuted in 1994 with the title of Tales to Give You Goosebumps. And I didn't care too much for Tales to Give You Goosebumps. It just wasn't that great. And it spawned 5 sequels, and each book featured 10 short stories. And the short stories were just short. They were so short. The other spin-off series was Give Yourself Goosebumps, which is my least favorite series. And that's the series where you get to pretty much pick and choose your own way. And if you don't pick the right way, you die. And Give Yourself Goosebumps debuted in 1995. After the original series was discontinued in December of 1997, it was followed up by Goosebumps Series 2000, the very next month. So one interesting little tidbit about the Tales to Give You Goosebumps series was that it ran from October 1994 to October 1997, but it also had ghost writers writing them as well, instead of just Rl Stein himself, because his contract never said that he couldn't call people in to help him write this series, and I'm pretty sure that's why it didn't do too well. Now we're going to talk about the Give Yourself Goosebumps series of books, which ran from July 1995 to February of the year 2000. And so after the success of the original Goosebumps series, Rl Stein thought about making a sort of spin-off where there was more than one ending that a reader could choose, and so there were more scares, of course. And so he wanted to sort of make these choose-your-own-adventure books. And so at the bottom of each page of a Give Yourself Goosebumps book, there are choices that the reader can make, and depending on which choice they make, it will send them in one direction or the other. A lot of the times, from my experience from reading those, no matter what choice you made, it would sort of wrap around on itself and take you in a circle, or it would take you to the same place as a completely other sort of choice later on down the line. So sometimes your choices didn't matter, but sometimes they actually did. So the sort of idea behind these Give Yourself Goosebumps books is that there's over 20 endings per book, And sometimes the player had to make choices in real life by either flipping a coin, rolling a dice, or depending if it's sunny or not outside. And if you made the wrong choice, you would either have to go backwards in time or pick another choice or die. And that's one of the things I really didn't care for, because I was reading these books on my phone. And so I would constantly have to just keep hitting the back button over and over and over and over. So a lot of the stories for these Give Yourself Goosebumps books actually had 2 stories at the same time around the same plot. So depending on what choice you made at the beginning of each book depicted the story you would be reading at the time. So if you would go back and reread and then choose the other sort of choice at the very beginning of the book, the story is completely different. And I thought that was kind of interesting. That's why I really liked Escape from the Carnival of Horrors, because it either let you go on a roller coaster or go play the midway. And if you chose the midway, you met like a fortune teller. Or if you chose the roller coaster instead at the very beginning, the roller coaster breaks down and then you have to go out on your own, that sort of thing. 2 completely different plot lines, but they all wrap around into the same ending. And speaking of the endings, not only were there a crap ton of bad endings where you either die or get trapped or whatever, but there were actually quite a few good endings depending on what you did. Sometimes the good ending would come out of nowhere, like if you did a stupid thing and somehow it worked, the book would just end. And a lot of people were really confused about some of these endings because it seems like they died again, because they might be like in the middle of the story and then all of a sudden they win. A lot of the times the books would just end by saying the end, or just end, or game over, or something like that. And it's very confusing because you don't know if you did the right thing or not. Then a lot of the endings would actually make fun of the reader themselves for being scared or cowardly, because sometimes you would decide to either turn back and not face the monster, and that would give you a bad ending, and then the text on the book would actually say that you're a loser or something like that, or that you're boring. And so some of the endings for these books were death, permanent transformation, slavery, becoming frozen or transforming into a stationary object, an inanimate object, dying and becoming a ghost or undead, missing out on the adventure entirely, getting trapped, winding up in the wrong space or time, discovering yourself, being scolded by the book and the writers, surviving with something wrong at the end, surviving but not accomplishing anything, or surviving and achieving your main goal. Then during the production of the 43rd book of the Give Yourself Goosebumps, Rl Stein had a fallout with Scholastic, and so the book was actually canceled in early 2000. So details about the book are completely unknown. But the artwork for the cover from the artist was actually leaked. And there were 3 penguins who were huge. And so they think that the 43rd book would have been themed around the Arctic. The next book series was Goosebumps Series 2000. And this series was published from January 1998 to January of 2000. And it began with Cry of the Cat, and Cry of the Cat was released 1 month after the end of the final book of the original Goosebumps series. Series 2000 ended with Ghost in the Mirror, and only 25 books were published in the series, and then there was 1 unpublished. And this 26th book was The Incredible Shrinking Fifth Grader. And the series ended abruptly as Rl Stein's contract with Scholastic ended. Along with the Give Yourself Goosebumps, he had planned a Goosebumps Gold series. Another spin-off series was Goosebumps Horrorland, which I'm currently trying to read through. There's like 19 books or something. But it was running from April 2008 to January of 2011 with 19 books published. Yes. And pretty much what Goosebumps Horrorland was, a single universe with all the monsters in it at once. And they were all trying to get these protagonists to go to Horrorland. So each of the books had 2 stories each. The first 10 books had their own stories at the very beginning. And then at the very end of the book, there were at least 7 extra chapters where it was taking place in Horrorland for that specific book's protagonist. And then from books 13 through 19, it featured a singular storyline where all the characters from the original books were finally together and they were trying to get through Horrorland and try to escape. Then in the 19th book, it wrapped pretty much everything up. Everything was fixed and hunky-dory at the end. Next up was the Goosebumps Hall of Horrors from March of 2011 to April of 2012. And it was a mini-series consisting of 6 books, and each book featured a story told by a child visiting the titular Hall of Horrors. Unlike the Horrorland books, the Hall of Horrors had no overarching plot, and each book had an independent story. Next was the Goosebumps Most Wanted series from July 2012 to October of 2016. So this ran for about 4 years. And this series contained 10 main books, 4 special editions, and 1 standalone novel. And the series began in 2012 with The Haunted Mask and ended with The Lizard of Oz in 2016. Like with the previous series, most of the books contained an introductory section. And in this series, Stine introduces the main villain of the book in Welcome, You Are the Most Wanted section, because there was a section at the beginning of each of these books pretty much explaining what's going on. And each of the cover arts showed the main villain of the book, and each one had a color behind them, trying to make it look like a wanted poster, I suppose. Then there were a few film books based off the 2 movies. They were sort of tie-ins to the main first movie in 2015. And most of the books were just novelizations, pretty much where it kind of turns it into a comic book where the movie is a comic book. And so you get to watch the movie by just reading it. And then the rest were just activity books. And now currently he is working on Goosebumps Slappy World, where currently there are 7 books available and then 7 are to be released. And it started in February of 2017 and it is still going on today. And so Slappy World is the current main Goosebumps series. It is the successor to Most Wanted, and the series focuses on Slappy the Dummy, telling you his twisted tales and scary stories. The first book in the series, Slappy Birthday to You, was released on February 28th, 2017. And the series was first announced from Stine on March 1st of 2016 on a small Q&A session. And currently the Slappy World design for Slappy is based off his appearance in the 2015 film. So I'm really excited for this podcast. I hope you all enjoyed learning all about the history of Goosebumps and Rl Stein, giving you a nice little backstory as to what's been going on over all these years, because it's been going on for almost 24 years. Maybe it's already been 24 years. I'm not sure. But I hope you will all enjoy this podcast. I'm planning on doing the very first official sort of episode next week on Thursday. It's going to be a Thursday show. where we're going to start out with book 1, Welcome to Dead House. And we are going to do comparisons between the episode, and I'll also be talking about what the story is about for that specific book. And then, of course, we're going to keep going from there. But we have a lot to cover, and I'm excited to do it. So let's get into it. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you next time. And that's how I got Goosebumps.